Have you ever noticed that the same 100 rupee buys fewer things today than it did a few years ago? Let me show you a quick example. Last year, a plate of Maggi might have cost around 40 rupees, but today the same plate may cost 55 rupees. A cold drink that earlier cost 55 rupee may now cost 60 rupee or more. And the same thing happens with many everyday items. So prices of many goods seem to increase over time. But does every price increase mean inflation? Think. Suppose the price of onions increases because of a bad harvest. Is that inflation? Many students think the answer is yes, but the correct answer is no. This is because inflation refers to something much broader than a single price increase. Think about different goods we buy every day. Food items like pizza, cheese, or flour. Drinks like soft drinks. Over time, we often notice that the prices of many of these goods increase. And when this kind of price increase happens across many goods and services in the economy, economists describe it as inflation. In simple terms, inflation is a persistent rise in the general price level of goods and services over a period of time. And as prices rise, something important happens. The purchasing power of money falls. What exactly does purchasing power mean? Purchasing power simply refers to what your money can buy. A few years ago, 500 rupees might have allowed you to buy 5 or more items from a grocery store. But today, the same 500 rupee may buy only 2 or 3 items. The money itself hasn't changed, but the value of money has fallen. In other words, when prices rise because of inflation, the purchasing power of money decreases, meaning your money buys fewer goods and services than before. How do economists actually measure inflation? Inflation is measured using something called price indices. The most commonly used measure is the Consumer Price Index or CPI. CPI tracks the changes in prices of goods and services that consumers typically buy, such as food, clothing, housing, and transport. Another important measure is the Wholesale Price Index or WPI. WPI measures changes in prices at the wholesale level, meaning the prices at which goods are sold in bulk between producers and businesses. So by tracking these price indices, economists can actually estimate how fast prices are rising in an economy. Why does inflation happen in the first place? Economists generally explain inflation through two main causes. The first is demand pull inflation, which occurs when demand in the economy increases faster than supply. The second is cost push inflation, which happens when the cost of production rises, forcing firms to increase prices. Let's understand each of these causes one by one. First is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when spending in the economy increases. For example, this may happen when people's incomes rise, government spending increases, or credit becomes easily available. As a result, demand for goods and services increase. But if producers cannot increase supply quickly enough, demand begins to exceed supply. And when demand is greater than supply, businesses respond by raising prices. And when prices rise across many goods and services in the economy, we get inflation. Because this inflation is caused by increasing demand, it is called demand pull inflation. Let's now look at how demand pull inflation appears in a diagram. On the vertical axis, we have the price level, and on the horizontal axis, we have real GDP or output. Initially, the economy is at equilibrium at point E1, where your aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. Now suppose demand in the economy increases. This may happen because people have higher incomes, more credit is available, or government spending increases. As a result, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right from AD1 to AD2. The new equilibrium moves from now E1 to E2. Notice what happens. The price level rises from PLE to PL1. This increase in the price level caused by rising demand is called demand pull inflation. In simple words, too much demand chasing too few goods. What could be the main reasons that lead to an increase in demand in an economy? One important cause is an increase in the money supply. When more money circulates in the economy, people tend to spend more. Another reason is an increase in disposable income, meaning people have more money available to spend after paying taxes. Demand can also rise because of population growth, which increases the number of consumers in the economy. Similarly, higher export demand can increase overall demand when foreign countries buy more goods from a country. Finally, even higher investment spending by businesses can also increase demand in the economy. To remember these causes easily, you can use the mnemonic MedPie. M money supply, E export demand, disposable income is for D, P population, and I is investment. All these factors increase demand in the economy, which pulls prices upward, leading to demand pull inflation. A simple example is the festival season, when people buy more clothes, food, and gifts, causing demand to rise and prices to increase. Cost push inflation follows a different sequence. Unlike demand pull inflation, this type of inflation begins from the supply side of the economy. Suppose the price of fuel, wages, or raw materials increase. This increases the cost of production for firms. When production costs rises, it becomes more expensive for firms to produce goods and services, and therefore to protect their profits, firms may increase prices or sometimes even reduce supply. As a result, the overall price level in the economy rises, leading to cost push inflation. Let's understand cost push using a diagram. On the vertical axis, we have the price level, and on the horizontal axis, we have real GDP or output. Initially, the economy is at equilibrium at point E1, where aggregate demand intersects aggregate supply. Now suppose production costs increase. For example, due to higher wages or higher fuel prices, because production becomes more expensive, firms supply less output at every price level. This causes the aggregate supply curve to shift left from AS1 to AS2. The new equilibrium moves from E1 to E2. Notice what happens now. The price level rises from PLE to PL1 while output falls from Y to Y1. This combination of higher prices and lower output is a key feature of cost push inflation. Cost push inflation occurs when the cost of production increases. One common reason is a rise in wages. If workers demand higher wages, firms face higher labor costs. Another important factor is an increase in the price of raw materials, such as metals, food, inputs, or energy. Higher taxes on goods such as indirect taxes can also increase production costs. Similarly, an increase in oil prices affect transportation and manufacturing costs across many industries. Finally, sometimes governments increase administrative prices such as electricity tariffs or regulated fuel prices. To remember these causes easily, use the mnemonic ROTA. W for wages, raw material prices R, T taxes, O oil prices, A administrative prices. A simple real-world example is when fuel prices rise. Higher fuel costs increase transportation and production costs, and businesses eventually pass these higher costs on to consumers through higher prices. This is which leads to cost push inflation. Remember the key difference. Demand pull inflation is too much demand, and cost push inflation is due to rising production costs. One important thing to understand about inflation is that it does not affect everyone in the same way. Some groups lose while others may actually benefit. First, we know that inflation leads to a fall in the purchasing power of money, which means that the same amount of money can now buy fewer goods and services than before. Second, people with fixed incomes suffer the most. This includes pensioners, salaried employees with fixed wages, or people receiving any type of fixed payment. If their income stays the same but prices rise, their real standard of living falls. The third effect is that inflation can create a situation where debtors gain and creditors lose. You get this question a lot. A debtor is someone who has borrowed money, while a creditor is someone who has lent money. During inflation, the borrower repays the loan with money that has lower purchasing power, which benefits the debtor but reduces the real value received by the creditor. However, you must also pay attention to that inflation does not always have only negative effects. Businesses may actually benefit during moderate inflation, especially when prices of their products rise faster than their costs. This can increase their profits and encourage production. As a result, inflation may sometimes increase production and economic activity in the short run. But if inflation becomes too high and unstable, it can create uncertainty and economic problems for the entire economy. So remember, inflation is not just about rising prices, it also affects people's income, savings, borrowing, and the overall economy. Now, an important question arises: how can inflation be controlled? Governments usually try to control inflation using two main types of policies. The first is monetary policy, which is implemented by the central bank. Through monetary policy, the central bank can reduce money supply, increase interest rates, and control credit in the economy. These tools include CRR, SLR, repo rate, and reverse repo rate. If you would like to understand these tools in detail, I have explained them in a separate video. You can check it out here. The second method is fiscal policy, which is implemented by the government. Through fiscal policy, the government may increase taxes or reduce public spending to reduce overall demand in the economy. Both these policies aim to stabilize prices and control inflation. Let's quickly summarize what we learned. Inflation refers to a rise in the general price level of goods and services over time, which leads to a fall in the purchasing power of money. We also saw that inflation can occur mainly due to two reasons. The first is demand pull inflation, where prices rise because demand in the economy increases faster than supply. The second is cost push inflation, where prices rise because the cost of production increases for businesses. Understanding these concepts help us analyze how prices behave in the real economy. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more students can benefit from it. See you in the next lesson.